May we begin with a word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. On more than one occasion, I have mentioned our connection to El Gorral and to our sister community in El Salvador, and I've had the blessing of having traveled there twice. And one of the things that you go once, you're just kind of taking it all in. Second time, you maybe observe things a little bit more because you've seen some things before. And aside from being in El Gorral proper, spent some time in San Salvador and La Palma, Suchitoto, some other cities and places we visited with learning not just about the community itself, but the entire country. We've been to some lakefront areas and or oceanfront areas. And some of the interesting things I noticed, there is one image you can find almost anywhere you go in that country. It's all over the place. It's an image of Oscar Romero, who was a priest and later bishop and activist for people during the Civil War in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s. And one of the things that's fascinating about Oscar Romero is he spoke out against the injustices that were happening in his country. He spoke adamantly against the military government of his day. But he also spoke out against the left-wing activists and extremists at the same time. He recognized that the extreme polar components of society brought more harm to the people that kind of were in the middle or had limited or no voice for themselves. And he felt there was another way that community could be nurtured within that country other than the extreme versions that it was taking. And he had a great following. He had a great energy behind him as he spoke about those injustices and willing to do that and willing to do so at the cost of his own life. In 1980, he was in the middle of Mass and was murdered in the middle of Mass in 1980, and his life was taken from him. And the images that are all around that country are a reminder of a man who knew something bigger than himself, bigger than his own life, that was more important for the wider whole to understand what it meant to live in equity and solidarity with one another in that country and hopefully beyond that country. I think there's little glimpses of that kind of mentality we find in the story of the Transfiguration. And this is one of those stories that probably is a little bit hard to understand. It's kind of a funky story, right? Kind of in the middle of Luke's gospel. You have Jesus finds three of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, and they go up the mountain and they have this experience, and it's kind of undescribable experience. They come back down the mountain, and he says, well, we're not going to tell anybody about it, but it's going to be impacting them in some way. And one of the key pieces, I think, in the story of the Transfiguration that's important to me is the intent of what Jesus was doing in that experience. I think one of the main things Jesus was trying to accomplish was, I want you to see glimmers or glimpses of what's possible and the things we can do with what we've already accomplished so far. And the other thing I think he wanted to do was move away from people looking directly at him and looking at the kind of ministry and the kind of life that he was trying to cultivate within the society in which he lived. And think of all the work that Jesus did of finding a voice for the voiceless and reaching out to people that felt excluded or outcast in some way. He wanted to make sure everyone had a seat at the table, everyone was included, everyone was loved, everyone had a part to play in the wider community, even when the systems at play, the politics and the power and the privilege was minimizing people's either participation or inclusion at all in society. He said, I want people to see that. I'd rather them not point at me. We sometimes can look at people and think, this is the person that's going to solve our problems. This will be the person that will carry us where we need to go. We sometimes get too wrapped up in the cult of personality. When I was in seminary, I had a roommate that he was working in a church as an associate. And the church he was working in, the senior pastor of that church, he not only adored the pastor and cared a lot about that pastor, thought he was going to model his entire ministry after this pastor's ministry. He thought, this is the way I want to do my ministry. It's successful, it's thriving, it's all these great things. All he could talk about were all the things the senior minister did and all the things he wanted to do when he became a senior minister. It was just, I always heard crazy talk from my roommate. This person. I thought, man, it seemed that person has kind of been elevated way up here. And then after one weekend was completed, he came back to the apartment after a long weekend at the church, and my roommate's demeanor was just flat. You could tell his head was down. His body language had totally changed. He was not his happy, kind of go-lucky self. And finally got around to saying, something's gone on. What happened this weekend? He said, well, the senior minister came and talked to me privately that he was about to talk to the church, that he had made a huge mistake, that he had an affair with the secretary of the church, and he didn't know what the future of his life meant going forward or how the church was going to respond. And my roommate was just floored. And he said I'd put this person up so high in terms of the person I wanted to emulate, and that very person I recognized was as human as me. And I realized that I had done this to an individual to my own detriment, my own well-being. He said, I just don't know if I could do ministry. I mean, even though I know it's not wrapped up in that person, I've been so devastated, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. And so every morning, we shared a bathroom, and I would get to the restroom first because my classes were earlier than his, and I would leave a sticky note on the mirror in the bathroom for him when he got in there. You can do this. You're capable of more than you can think. Every day had a different sticky note to it. And I didn't do that to say that I kept him in ministry. But I will say, he said those notes were an important piece of me reminding myself of the reasons why I got in ministry in the first place. I'm grateful that he is still in ministry today, working on the facets of ministry and not letting personalities drive the work that he does. This transfiguration story is, when you look at it just as a story by itself, is a fascinating, interesting story. But I think there's a larger context to this transfiguration story that are worth noting, is that those early readers, that first century readers, would have noticed some things right away that we may not notice, or we kind of just gloss over because we don't have the context for them. And the first of those, I'm going to read the very first verse, and I'm sure you're going to be just mesmerized when I read this verse because you're going to think about it right away. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, John, and James and went up the mountain to pray. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, man, I got that. That's the most phenomenal verse I've ever heard in my life. But the first century readers would have read that. They would have immediately thought of Moses going up the mountain to experience God and to receive whatever commandments God would offer him to bring back down to the people. That going up to the mountain had that same imagery for those readers of the experience of Moses going up the mountain. That's the author of Luke wanted that imagery to be embedded in the mind of the reader to pick up the historical pieces of that going up the mountain. And so when Jesus makes this invitation to go up the mountain, there's something significant's about to happen. We're being taken to a special place. There's also the notion that elevation also designated a sense of the higher I go, the more sacred that space of that land will be. I mean, the old Temple Mount, it was on the Temple Mount, it was almost like you ascended up into the old temple grounds. It wasn't like the temple grounds were flat. It was an elevated piece. And the further up you went, the holier the encounter was into that temple ground. And so making that move up to the mountain was important. So you had that whole Exodus mindset. And then in the Gospel of Luke, there are three moments that I think, and we get a lot of moments that are significant in the Gospel, but three stick out to me. One is this story right in chapter 9. The other one is the story in chapter 3, which was his baptism. And the other is the story of the resurrection. And I think those three stories shape the entire narrative of the gospel story, and I'll share why. So in the baptism story, when Jesus is baptized at the River Jordan, Jesus comes out of the water, we hear a voice from heaven that says, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." And we hear that phrase, that voice speaking. And it's at that point after baptism that Jesus is able to take the energy of that baptism and gather the initial followers together and embark on this ministry that Jesus has. And they go out and heal and teach and feed and do all these and include and do all these things to the point where people kept thinking, he's the one, he's the one, he's the one, he's the guy, this is the person. I mean, cult of personality. This person is the person we need to be paying attention to. And then we get to this middle story of the transfiguration. And we hear another voice. "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And again, we had the same voice, almost the exact same words right here again in the middle of the gospel, saying the work is not yet done. There's still so much to do in the world. Let us not get distracted by the people around us and get activated by the work this person invites us to be involved with. And then you have the resurrection story. And at the end of the resurrection story, when the disciples finally learn about the resurrection, there's a little bit of fear and trembling at the beginning, but it says once they get activated, they are on fire to do all the things that Jesus invited them to do. In each case, starting with the baptism, the voice, that experience of encountering something special, unique in that moment, created momentum. The transfiguration story, right in the middle of the gospel, this moment where these disciples get to experience something out of the ordinary, it propels them to do even greater things. And then again at the resurrection, even greater things after that. Now, it's kind of a fascinating story when I think about it. These three disciples go up with Jesus to the mountain. They get up there and they do I guess the gospel does its best to try to describe what happened. Jesus transfigures, he's more like light than human being, and then these two other figures appear, Moses and Elijah's there, and maybe out of wisdom or out of gut reaction or I don't know what else to say, they say, "Let's set up camp. Let's hang out here. I don't want to leave this moment." They've encountered something significant, and if you've ever had a moment where you felt the palpable presence of God, if maybe a spiritual high, maybe not everyone has felt that, but if you've had an opportunity to feel a spiritual high or I feel like I could just reach out and feel God's presence in my life. When you have those kind of moments, you want them to last as long as possible. We don't know when they come along, but when they come along, we want to kind of bask in that moment saying, why can't I just live up at this little high all my life? It's a really hard thing to do. We recognize if we step away from that high, there's life to live. There's challenges to navigate. There's struggles that we encounter. All that is a part of the journey. We'd rather much be back at that spiritual high when it seems like there's no worries. There's nothing to worry about. It can't get any better than this moment right now. So the disciples want to set up camp and hang out. And that's when they hear this voice, "This is my Son. Listen to him. Pay attention to what he's saying." He is a vehicle for something more significant to happen. Several years ago, I've mentioned maybe once before, I had the opportunity to travel to Atlanta, Georgia, and visit Ebenezer Baptist Church. And that is the church where Martin Luther King Jr. served, and is also his father, Martin Luther King, served. And when I visited that church, it was, and is still the pastor, is Raphael Warnock, who's a current Georgia senator, but he's also still the senior pastor of that church in Atlanta, Georgia. Myself and a group of other pastors got to go and visit Raphael Warnock and got to spend an hour with him having conversation and dialogue. He was a really fascinating individual, just a super quality person, a deep thinker about things. And I remember one of the ministers I was with said, "How do you do ministry in this place knowing who's come before you? How do you do ministry knowing that Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King served this church? How do you do church when you've got all that history? Does it overshadow or does it intimidate you in any way? And he had a powerful response. Before I get to the response, how we think about the perspective of a church in terms of where it is in its arc of ministry is important. Ken Callahan used to say that when a church body feels like the best days of the church were previous days, that church has resigned itself to death. But a church whose best days are in front of it has enabled that church to think about life and possibilities of its health and possibilities going forward. Our perspective about church, and churches are notorious for looking back when we worshiped this number of people, back when we did this ministry, that was a really good day back then, versus thinking those might have been good times, but in our mind, if the best of the church isn't in front of us, we are just spinning our wheels in terms of the present moment. So Raphael Warnock, in his response to that question, says, when people or congregants ask me that question, my response is simply this: what have you done lately? He said he knew that church had done significant work in the area of civil rights during the King eras, standing up for people, giving voice for people, doing significant things. If our church today, he said, just rest on the past of things accomplished decades ago, and we just kind of rest on that as our identity, we give ourselves excuses today to do nothing. I want our church to be as active today around matters of justice as we were back when they were serving the church. Maybe some of those justice issues are the same, or maybe they are new. But I want our church to identify those places of injustice and be actively engaging in the world with how we need to speak to the world here and now. So we can go up to the mountaintop. We can set up camp. We can freeze frame and hold what we want, saying we've done enough. Look what we've done in the past, and be satisfied. Or we can be humbled and Jesus take us back down the mountain saying, well, this is maybe a glimpse of what we're supposed to be, but there's so much work left to do. So many people that need opportunities to hear a word of hope. So many people that need to hear a word of inclusion. So many people that need to see there's a different way of how we live and engage the world with one another. The word transfiguration, or transfigure, is a little bit different than transform. If I go to an event that transforms me, it means I think differently than I did before. That really was a transforming event. I think differently, I process differently. Maybe my way of changing, of how I interact and do things is different. If I'm transfigured is a little bit different. There's still change that goes on, but it means I am moved to a more exalted level of myself than I was before. When Jesus is transfigured, the disciples get in that experience evidences of Jesus' future glory or his divinity, of something more than they had seen before. Has a kind of a new understanding than what he had before. He was kind of an exalted sense of being, exalted sense of self. I think partly that exalted self and that transfigured moment for Jesus and for the disciples to one, see what was possible, not only in who Jesus was, but to see what was possible in them. And it was easy to say, well, if it can't get any better than this moment, let's just set up camp. But he says, no, we're going back down. There's work to do. There's people to serve. There's work to do within ourselves as well as the people we're called to serve. I think this transfiguration experience that Jesus has on the mountain really is about two ways of thinking about it. One is we go up to see, but we come down to do. And we can think about those moments that catapult us forward, recognizing it's not about who Jesus was, but what Jesus was about in the work that he did. In 3 years of working in the countrysides, in Galilee and Jerusalem, all those places, he made it possible for us to think differently about ourselves and the communities in which we live so that it can be a more just, equitable, solidarity type of community that we engage with one another. So maybe we think to ourselves, yeah, I can be transformed pretty easily. But what would it take for me to be transfigured, to exalt myself up to a new level of thinking of how I engage the world with faithfulness and hope and possibility? Amen.